Let me now welcome you all officially and to today's event, which will be discussing Tunisia. We are partnering with the Zogby Research Services, Jim Zogby, our dear friend. Once again, we do this from time to time, partner with the Middle East Institute and Zogby Research Services. He will be reviewing and telling you a bit about a recent poll conducted in Tunisia on what Tunisians think about their government and their future, and it is going to be an extremely interesting presentation, I'm sure. Moderating today is MEI's newest Vice President, Paul Salem. We're very pleased to see him. Yesterday was his first day at the Middle East Institute, so we're thrilled to have Paul join us. Paul is coming to MEI from Beirut, where he was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut from 2006 to 2013. Before that, he served as director of the Ferris Foundation, founder-director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, and in 2002 on the Senior Review Committee for UNDP's Arab Human Development Report. He's published a great deal. He's a frequent commentator. He's written many, many books, and now we look to him to bring real intellectual heft to the Middle East Institute. And we're thrilled to have him, and we're thrilled to have this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul now to introduce the rest of the speakers. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at the banquet.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much, Wendy. Indeed, it's my second day at work at MEI, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this panel. I came from Beirut, and I was happy, leaving a failed state there. I was pleased that the U.S. also has, government closures and so on. So I feel right at home. Let us go straight to our very timely and very interesting panel based around a survey that James Zogby and the Zogby Research Group has done on public opinion in Tunisia. Obviously Tunisia, where Arab Spring events started and sparked uprisings throughout the Arab world. And Tunisia, which is perhaps finding a different way to move forward with these tensions, different than what happened in Egypt, obviously very different than what happened in Syria, and so on. So definitely a very important story, not only for Tunisians, but for the Arab world in general, and to see in which direction that will go. Our main presenter today is Mr. James Zogby, an old friend. Many of us probably have been on his well-known TV show, which he hosts. Jim is head of the Arab American Institute. He's also head of Zogby Research. Does a lot of polling, very key polling in the Arab world. He's also a visiting professor at NYU in Abu Dhabi. And I'm very pleased to see him again, and looking forward to his remarks. He will give a presentation of the poll findings. You have copies of it with you or at the desk outside. Then we will have reflections and comments from the other two panelists whom I will introduce after Jim makes his presentation. So Jim, if you want from the podium, go ahead.
I am sorry I am late, Wendy. But my office had written down, I spoke with Kate, I knew it was 12, they wrote down 12:30. And I was leisurely having a cup of soup and just...
We love you, Jim.
And I got a call from my office saying, they're freaking, get over there. So I'm really sorry, everyone, that I'm late. This is the second time we polled in Tunisia. We polled early on in the Arab Spring, and actually in 2011. And back then, I was struck by the numbers. They're all available on our website, Zogby Research Services, and also on the Arab American Institute website. Back then, I was struck by the tentativeness of the responses in Tunisia, which were different than every other country that we polled in. In some cases, 30 to 40% not sure how things were going to come out. When we asked them better off, worse off, where's this going to go? I actually thought it was a very mature set of answers, rather than the kind of responses we got in other countries, which reflected early on a polarity in in the debate. In Tunisia, there was this sense that we know that there's change, but we're going to give it time to see how it is. Well, they've given it some time, and here's what we've got. The poll was done in the month of August, from the 4th to the 31st, right before, actually, the government, they announced that they were going to be stepping down and negotiating over an interim solution. We polled 3,031. It was a very large survey, like the Egypt ones, covering every part of the country. The demographics were themselves a fascinating study of the characteristics of Tunisia today. But what we found were numbers that were strikingly similar in many ways to the Egypt numbers. An increasing polarization in the debate, and a kind of an exhaustion with the ruling party. The first finding is here. When it began, how hopeful were you? One of the few questions that we got consensus across the board. The total was very high. When we ask those, and this is a subgroup that we're going to use throughout the survey, those who have confidence in Ennahda and those who say they do not have confidence in Ennahda, it was about 28% confidence in Ennahda, 72% say no confidence in Ennahda. But when we ask them the same question, you see that they both agree. Both were extremely hopeful in 2011. When we ask, how's your attitude today, when you see how it's played out, you get the country split not quite in half, less than half, hopeful, majority not hopeful. But those who are confident in Ennahda, very hopeful still, and those who are less confident, no confidence in Ennahda, almost 80% not hopeful. Do you feel Tunisia is moving in the right or wrong direction? 2/3 to 1/3, it's moving in the wrong direction. And again, those confident in Ennahda, very strongly convinced it's moving in the right direction. Those with no confidence in Ennahda almost uniformly believe that it is not moving in the right direction. We asked a whole series of questions about how important they were, and then we asked how effective the government is in handling these issues. These were three. I pulled out 3 of the 11 just as an example. All of them were in the 90, mid-90 range. Very important issues: combating terrorism and extremism, expanding employment opportunities, high cost of living. They were all in the top tier, the top 4 or 5 issues in terms of importance, but in terms of effectiveness, they were in the bottom 1/3. Not effective at all dealing with high cost of living or expanding employment or combating extremism and terrorism. What, in your opinion, best describes the way the current coalition government is operating? It's dominated by Ennahda. Overwhelmingly, they say that, although those who have confidence in Ennahda say it's not true, but those who have no confidence in Ennahda saying they are the dominant party, and that is reflected as well in, is it a balanced coalition? The government, is it a balanced coalition that ensures moderation? Those who have confidence in Ennahda, again, overwhelmingly say yes, it is. Those with no confidence, including Ennahda's partners, I might add, say that it is not a balanced coalition that ensures moderation. How committed do you believe that Ennahda is to fulfilling the goals of the revolution? How committed do you believe Ennahda is to a pluralist, open society in Tunisia? Again, you get about the 27-28% who are Ennahda supporters all saying that it is fulfilling the goals, that it is pluralistic and open. The rest of the country absolutely convinced that it is not, and that the party is not pluralistic and open. The draft constitution was interesting because here Tunisians remind me actually more of Americans than not. My brother used to say there ought to be a bumper sticker that says, "I don't know nothing and I vote." We asked Tunisians, do you approve the Constitution? We actually asked them first, do they know anything about the Constitution? And the majority said they don't, but that did not stop them from having an opinion. That's the parallel, I mean, that's similar. But in any case, it's an indication of trust, and it's an indication of confidence, and it's an indication of the fact that the party has exhausted itself in terms of public opinion. Those who are confident in Ennahda a majority saying that they approve the draft constitution, overwhelmingly those who don't have confidence, again, that's 72% of the population right from the get-go, overwhelmingly disapprove of the Constitution. And so if we're going to see a movement of finishing the draft Constitution before the government changes, a lot of work to be done, not only to finish a document, but also to build the public trust that will see that document passed. So what we have is a divided country and a dissatisfied country. I finished my article on this, though, saying the Arab Spring was alive and well in Tunisia, because the process of dissatisfaction expressing itself both in public opinion but also in mobilization and creating what appears to be at this point a more or less peaceful transition is itself, I think, something very hopeful to keep an eye on. But certainly a lot of work to be done to cross the divide between the two parts of Tunisian society. On the question, was it legitimate for the ANC to have extended their term? Absolutely not. No support for that, except from the Ennahda party. And the ANC viewed as illegitimate, which is precisely why the call for the government to step down and finish the job. I might add, too, that in questions about drafting in the Constitution, setting a date for election, again, great public dissatisfaction that the government had not done the job they were supposed to do, which basically was to create these transitional steps, and they hadn't done them. So that's the results of what we got so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. If I may, I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions before turning to the panel. I mean, the differences you point to, I mean, differences could be part of a healthy democratic process. It creates balance. It creates alternative points of view. And when we look at, you said there's similarity in a sense that Egypt, opinion is divided, Tunisia, opinion is divided, but obviously the paths now are clearly very different. In questions that you posed, or the sense that you got between questions you asked in Tunisia and in Egypt, I wanted to ask about two things. Were there any questions that you could get a sense of their legitimization of the process of elections, government formation, sort of the democratic process as something they commit to in a major way? Where, you know, in Egypt today you have that controversy that, well, we tried democracy perhaps, we came out with a bad outcome, we're trying something else. Tunisia's still sticking to it. Did that come out in any of the questions?
Well, you know, I actually wrote in the executive summary something that I wouldn't have written exactly the same way if I thought about it a little bit better, to tell you the honest truth. And that is, I said that unlike Egypt, the Tunisians weren't turning to the military. Actually, in the first poll we did in Egypt, the second poll, they were very supportive of what the military had done. But in the first poll, not the case. Actually, the numbers were very similar. Tunisians, Egyptians didn't want the military to take over. The only group in Egypt that did want them to take over was the Tamarud group. The Brotherhood was deadly opposed to it, but the other parties were sort of indifferent and in between. Same kind of thing I'm seeing here in the Tunisian numbers. The other big difference is on the issue of Islam. The big concern in Egypt was that they were Islamicizing the country. That is not the issue here. It is the ineffectiveness of the government and the inability to protect the security of citizens. That was the thing that was the motivator, not the fact that they, do they believe it's a Muslim party with an agenda, etc. I think that maybe that they have a sense of confidence enough that they can resist that as a culture, and maybe the Egyptians were threatened more so, but that's only speculation. From the numbers, though, that would not be the principal reason why people in Tunisia were opposed to Ennahda. It was they'd screwed up. They didn't do a good job. That's the issue. On the last question, is there a sense of do they agree on the process? To the extent to which they're not favorable they weren't favorable toward what happened in Egypt, that they didn't think that what happened in Egypt had any lessons for them in the sense that it was going to be a model for how they would move forward. I would say that what I gathered from this is that I feel confident to say Arab Spring's alive and well. I mean, as opposed to those who see the fall of this government as a sign that even in Tunisia it's falling apart, I don't think that's the lesson here. I think the lesson here is that there is a transitional process underway. People are committed to it, and hopefully it'll bear fruit.
All right, thank you. Let's turn to our two other panelists. I'll introduce them briefly. Their bios are in your paperwork. Mr. Radwan Masmoudi is head of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. He's a Tunisian scholar, he's a Tunisian activist, probably known to many of you, has written a lot on Islam and democracy and human rights. And he's been in Tunisia for the last 2 years, since the revolution there. Our other panelist is Mr. Bill Lawrence. Professor Lawrence currently is at the International Affairs, at the Elliot School at George Washington University, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs. He was, in the last 2 years, with the International Crisis Group, heading the North Africa group, and he had been previously with the State Department, working partly in North Africa or from Washington on those issues, comes with a lot of experience and knowledge of Tunisia and the region. Let me pose first a few questions to Mr. Masmoudi, if I may, based on what Jim has found in his findings. Let me ask first, in your sense, the decline of Ennahda's position from the election results of 2011 to perhaps these poll results and other sort of feedback that we get from Tunisia. How much, in your sense, is this sort of an inevitable course? Revolutions are always extremely hopeful, as we said, and many people remark that everybody's going to be disappointed because revolutions are very difficult, they're very disruptive, economies particularly have a very difficult time. So how much, in your sense, is it sort of inevitable that any attempt at governing in these 2 years would have led to a decline in the popularity of a ruling government? But more importantly, what are the steps or the policies that Ennahda took or did not take that in retrospect you think might have affected their position and public opinion, this division, and last Saturday the agreement and so on? We'll talk more about that later. But how do you sort of assess the last 2 years and how they did?
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Wendy and MEI, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be back at MEI. I think the overall conclusion of the data shows that Tunisians are divided and dissatisfied. I think overall that's a true statement. I think Tunisians have always been divided. They were united for a while against Ben Ali during the revolution, where the goal and the objective was obvious, to get rid of dictatorship. Everybody was united on that goal. We were fed up, or we had enough of the dictators, and everybody wanted to get rid of the dictatorship. After that, of course, you're going to have division because, okay, how do we move forward? What is the kind of society of political system that we're going to have? These divisions are normal. They existed before. They're going to exist, I think, well into the future. The question is, how do we manage these divisions? Do we manage them through the political democratic process, which is what we're trying to do, which is elections, which is freedom of association, freedom of expression, and let the people judge? And some parties will win, some parties will lose, but that is always reversible. I mean, in a democracy, if a party wins one time, doesn't mean it's going to win all the time. So the division is normal, and what we're trying to do is deal with it. Deal with it in a like you mentioned, the national dialogue, which just started recently, and we've always had. This is like the third or fourth time actually we've had the national dialogue conference. It's not the first time. So we've always had these dialogues and trying to find a middle ground. From the beginning. Everybody, including Ennahda, wanted to form a national unity government rather than a government that belongs to one particular party or another, for several reasons. First of all, no party is ready to govern Tunisia by itself, including Ennahda, but even other parties. The reality of dictatorship is that we don't have real political parties, except the ruling party, which we wanted to get rid of. So all of the other political parties, left or right, religious or secular, have zero experience in governing. and have very little capacity to run the affairs of the country. So it's a learning process for everybody. Ennahda asked for a national unity government immediately after the elections. I mean, in fact, they've said it even before the elections. This was, in 2011. Unfortunately, many in the opposition rejected that offer or refused to join this national unity government, except the two parties that did, which is the Takatul and the CPR. So Ennahda is not really governing, even though a lot of people have that impression. Ennahda has actually only 1/3 of the ministers are Ennahda members. Another third belongs to the other two parties, and another third is basically independents and technocrats. So the dissatisfaction is also normal. As you mentioned, after a revolution, the expectations are very high. People think, oh, that's it, we got rid of Ben Ali, now it's going to be a paradise. Well, it doesn't work quite that way. I think it will be a paradise, but not immediately.
Well, let me probe a bit.
It takes time.
Thank you for that. My specific question, especially when you compare it to Egypt, even supporters of the MB in Egypt identify certain decisions that were made as clearly problematic, whether it was the constitutional declaration or their forming a government in effect by themselves and so on. Are there any, when you look back at these 2 years of Ennahda participating in government as a strong player, are there any, other than the general disappointment and difficulties of revolutions, are there any decisions in retrospect that you assess as having been particularly problematic, that have, you've indicated a general openness, a general inclusivity, which when you compare it to Egypt is definitely true. Is there anything you would highlight before going to my last question?
My most serious criticism of Ennahda has been that it was too lenient with the Salafis, especially in the first year or year and a half. I've written about this, many articles. Many of them are my friends, but I told them, I think their objective was to bring them into the political process and move them away from violence and radicalism. And, so they offered them, form a political party, join the political process, and become part of the new democratic system. That's a good approach, except with the jihadi group. It's a small minority of the Salafis. Maybe 10% of all Salafis are what they call jihadis. But from the beginning, they said, we belong to Al-Qaeda, we believe in Osama bin Laden and all that. These are dangerous people.
And you identify that certainly as one of the things that frightened people.
I think it frightened people, and it gave them a chance to grow, the danger to become more real. I'm very happy and very glad that since the September 14th attack on the U.S. Embassy, I think this has changed drastically. Now Ennahda and the government has learned the lesson, and now they are really in a war against these groups. And in my opinion, it's been carried out very well. And they are really fighting these groups and arresting and killing. And, the army and the police are really doing a fantastic job. One thing that I think unites all Tunisians is we cannot afford violence. We have to keep violence out, and therefore we have to fight against violence.
Well, my last quick question to you before moving to Bill is how, looking forward, there is now this agreement, supposedly a new government to be formed, new prime minister, and then the constitution, elections, and so on. What do you take from these poll findings, the lessons that Ennahda may have, learned, not learned, whatever? How do you see, given that we are sort of also at a turning point now in Tunisia, hopefully a positive one, what are some remarks about how you see things moving forward with Ennahda, particularly? How are they going to approach this new phase?
I think, first of all, Ennahda will remain one of the leading parties in Tunisia. Their popularity, I think, is always going to be around 30%. The approval rating of 28% actually is good news for them, because in the current situation and the current difficulties, to still have 28% approval rating, that's actually very good. So the good news is that they will remain a strong party, but they cannot rule by themselves. Ennahda will always get somewhere around 30, 35, maybe 40%. So there is always going to be a need for coalitions between Ennahda and other parties and almost all of the other parties are secular parties, so there will be a balance between that. So
So you see a positive
I see a positive, and it's a learning
Yeah.
curve. It's a learning curve. We have to realize that democratic transitions take time. It's not going to be done in 1 year or 2 years. We have to understand it takes time. All the political parties are very weak. They are building their base. They are building their programs, their ideologies, their memberships. So it takes time, but I think we're on the right path. I think in general, we agree on the path forward. We need to finish the Constitution. And by the way, it's true, the people don't really know what's going on with the Constitution. The media hasn't covered, the debates very well. But there's been tremendous work done on the Constitution for a year and a half. Huge dialogue, huge debates. And basically, there is a consensus on the Constitution. I really don't think that we will have a problem.
Once it's known.
Once they start to vote on it, I think it will pass with a 2/3 majority very, very easily.
Okay.
Then we have to form this neutral, non-political government, to reduce tensions and fears and all that. And
hold elections.
And organize elections in 4 months or 4 to 6 months. That's the path forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Bill, let me throw you an open question. What struck you about these poll results? Are they surprising? Do they, give grounds for sort of you've been working, thinking, writing about Tunisia for a long time and following events in that region. What strikes you?
Thank you, and thank you to Wendy for putting this together, and Kate Seeley, who's not here, and you for moderating, and Megan, and everyone else, and Radwan for participating, and James Zogby, of course, for this amazing research. I was very struck reading the poll results, not because there was anything in there that shocked me, but because it was the degree, as the title indicates, and as the angle that Zogby's people took in analyzing the data. The degree of polarization was striking. When you look at the drops in hopefulness and credibility, and if you look at the indicators as Radwan summarized, over time, in just a brief span of 2.5 years, it's very striking how radically these numbers changed. There were also a lot of little hidden gems in the data, and not all of them were fully teased out by the text that goes along with the graphs. And one of the things that jumped out at me, which is not, it's a one sentence in the analysis, but it's not fully teased out, is the degree to which Tunisians see their problems as more economic than political. In our fieldwork for Crisis Group, we analyzed in a whole series of reports on Tunisia that the causes of both the revolution in Tunisia and the Tunisian Arab Spring were far more economic than political. The responses of the Tunisian government and the international community had been far more political than economic, and the underlying economic reasons for instability had gotten worse, and so there was plenty of there for further instability because the economy hadn't been fully addressed. The data on the security side was very interesting too, and getting back to what Radwan just said, there was an interesting optic which I read into the polling data, which this may be an overinterpretation, and I'm sure people do that sometimes, but I noticed that the people who had confidence in Tunisia seemed to look at the security issue as an issue of terrorism and extremism, whereas the people that didn't have confidence in Tunisia seem to have their differences of opinion over security of all Tunisians. And you can even hear that in what Radwan just said, and I think that difference of interpretation of this series of political assassinations and what that means for safety in Tunisian security is fairly significant, and those were the biggest gaps in the difference of effectiveness and importance in the poll, other than the women's issue, which is always the litmus test and headline grabber when it comes to the West's view of what's going on in this part of the world. But right up there is this big difference on the importance of economy over what the West is seeing, big difference on how security is being handled through these two different optics. And let me just add one last thing. We in our analysis, we came up with the idea that the three things that need to be focused on were security, economics, and the judiciary. And I noticed that there was very little discussion about the judiciary, except in reference to corruption in this polling data, because without an effective judiciary that Tunisians have faith in, all of these issues that we're talking about, governance and corruption, won't be addressed. And I don't think Tunisians have a lot of faith in the judiciary yet, and it's not being adequately addressed by the government. I have lots more to say, but let me stop there.
Thanks, Bill. I wish if you would comment a bit on sort of the institutional framework within Tunisia that might be sort of the institutional background for some of these results and some of these opinions. It comes out in some of the polls, and especially when you compare it to Egypt. First of all, that the political parties in Tunisia have more solid, audience. And there's more depth to the plurality in the Tunisian scene than you have in Egypt. Nida Tunis, new sort of is quite strong, and some of the other parties are providing some kind of competition and balance, which might reassure people. Secondly, the strong role of the Tunisian Labor Federation, which had an immense role to play in the mediation, is perhaps the most powerful force in Tunisia, although not expressly political, but very, very powerful, as well as a very powerful women's movement, certainly the strongest in the Arab world, and a vibrant civil society in general. And you work you in Tunis, on Tunis. I wonder if you would comment a bit on that, particularly when you compare it. I mean, you have a very strong society in Tunisia, a fairly weak state in terms of a military, so which doesn't have the capacities, whereas in Egypt, you really have somewhat the reverse. What does that tell you about the process?
Well, I've got a few things to say on that, but let me start by saying I love how Mr. Zogby made this initial comparison with Egypt, then questioned the comparison with Egypt, and laid bare a lot of interesting comparative conundrums we have when thinking about Egypt and Tunisia. And I don't think, with what we have in this poll, we really get to the end of that comparison. I frequently find, having worked on the region for 28 years, that I'm very frequently told, particularly in meetings in Washington, that there are differences between countries where they're not different on the issue that's being discussed, or there are similarities between countries where there are huge differences. I find we often get that split between what's common and what's non-common between the countries wrong. So just for example, the reason the crowds came out on the 30th of June in Egypt this year were very much similar to the reasons for the Tunisian revolution and instability in Tunisia. It was mostly economic. There were many more people out there because of the scarcity and price of fuel, cost of living increase, all these economic issues, and not a lot of the issues that people would like us to think that 30th of June was about, and the 3 July coup. And so if we don't understand where the people are in their own grievances, and this poll actually does expose that very well, we can't then understand the political dynamics with much sophistication. In terms of Tunisia's institutional history, it's astounding. Tunisia had the oldest constitution in the Arab world. It seems like every other party in history was Dastour or neo-Dastour, constitutional, and constitutional debates are in the DNA of Tunisian political debates. And it's a really strong foundation that Tunisians have to build on, that I also think goes well with Mr. Zogby's comments about the maturity of the debate and the trust in the constitutional debate that's going on. Although, that said, I fully agree with what Radwan just said about the weakness of the political parties. I mean, the parties were astoundingly weak and astoundingly disconnected from the population, despite those other institutional strengths. And if you look at the election results from October 2011, a lot of Tunisians voted anti-establishment. They were either voting anti-establishment by voting Ennahda, or they were voting anti-establishment by voting for the party of the businessman from London. And if you looked at the polling data before the election and then the election results, there was almost no connection. There were parties that were leading in the polls that didn't even score seats, and there were parties that hadn't even shown in the polls that got big percentages of the electorate. And my best interpretation, I did it for the BBC at the time, was this vote in 2011 was very largely anti-establishment. And I don't see any less anti-establishmentism in the Zogby polling results than we saw back then. So in that sense, I don't think we have institutional weakness to build on. Now, on UGTT's role, I think that's critically important and made Tunisia very different from the other Arab Spring countries, because without UGTT, you don't have a revolution in Tunisia. It was the teachers in Sidi Bouzid, it was their network across Tunisia, along with the diplômés chômeurs, the unemployed university graduates and other groups, that were the protagonists in the Tunisian revolution succeeding. And yet there was a debate within UGTT, because UGTT, the leadership was trying to play a mediating role and step in to stop what was going on, and it was the young, radical, Maoist, Trotskyist, hard left, UGTT activists on the ground who made this a national revolt before it went to the cities, before the middle class and upper class Tunisians started joining on. This was very much of a UGTT product. So they have a lot of credibility, as you said, institutionally going back decades. They have a lot of credibility in the revolution, and that's the reason why right now UGTT is the main organization of legitimacy in Tunisia right now, along with Ennahda. These are the two big forces. And most people just link UGTT now to Ennahda Tunis or to the other coalition of left-wing parties, but it's not that simple. UGTT has a lot of credibility and are helping keep Tunisia on track in ways that aren't happening in Egypt. Very quickly on the women's vote, in Tunisia we had a problem that the women's movements were so close to the regime that they were in disarray after the revolution. I've talked to a lot of feminist activists, and for the first 6-8 months after the revolution, they had almost nothing to say and no credibility in Tunisia, because they were so tied to what we in Middle East Studies called regime feminism, that they weren't able to have much to say in the constitutional or the political conversation right up through the election. They have reestablished themselves, they are reorganized, and they are playing a bigger and bigger role in constitutional debates now. But they were in disarray because of their connection to power. So overall, what I would say is that the mass of Tunisians still haven't bought in to this institutional process. They're kind of still on the sidelines. You still have a lot of frequent economic protests. I mean, something like 60 Ennahda party headquarters have been sacked over the last 2 years by protesting crowds, mostly on economic issues, and Ennahda is the most popular institution in the country. So I see a lot of anti-establishmentism that's at play here that doesn't get fully analyzed in a lot of the literature or in the polling. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just pose one more question before turning it to the floor, maybe either to Bill or to Radwan or even to Jim, and that's sort of the international aspect of it. I mean, obviously what happened in Egypt had a regional aspect to it at least. Some comment on Tunisia, and they make the links to, France and being close to there and being in a certain regional environment, maybe more, stable or tending in a different direction. The roles of Qatar, AKP early on in Turkey as an example or not. Ennahda seemed to be more positive about the Turkish experience, the MB in Egypt not so much. So my question, either if it ever came up in the polling or if it was at all relevant, Jim, people's views in Tunisia of the experiences of other countries or the influence of other countries, or from, Bill and Radwan, how do you see the sort of the international politics of what is going on right now? Jim?
Number one,
Closer to the mic.
in the couple of times this question has come up, I dare say that Tunisians see themselves a place apart. And that's true of many countries in the Middle East. Despite their organic links with other countries, they tend to see their experience as separate and separatable. But let me look at it another way, and that is something I don't have data for, but I do think is still relevant. From the very beginning, I used to call Tunisia Connecticut. It was the place. It's the place where, when you do a play, when you start off with a play, you go to Connecticut, and they show in the theaters in Connecticut, or sometimes they go down to the Schubert in Philadelphia, and they rework it and they retool it, and if it works, then you go to Broadway. Egypt is Broadway. And if it flops on Broadway, it flops big time. If it makes it on Broadway, it can go to Hollywood. That was Syria. It's a disaster in Hollywood. It's not doing so well on Broadway. but Connecticut is still working. And so it's I would see the Arab Spring process as sort of starting and going back now to restart again in Tunisia. How the Egyptians come out of this, I don't know. And I incidentally, no disrespect to Tunisia calling it Connecticut. It's a wonderful state. But I do think that there are reverberations here. If this thing had fallen completely, I think it would have sucked all the life out of this sense of the possibility of change, but it didn't. And so while the brotherhood has exhausted itself, and I think people are getting reinforced by that, you know, a flop in Egypt and a not doing so well in Tunisia and elsewhere, I think that the sense of the process is still alive and well. And I think Bill's point, correct to observe, I mean, in all the polling we do when we evaluate political priorities, I mean, it's fascinating. In Egypt, before the revolution, the top issue was the jobs and economy. Second was education. Third was healthcare. After the revolution, the first issue was jobs. The second issue was education. The third issue was healthcare. Most recently, that was the same priority. The only country, interestingly enough, in the Middle East where political issues dominated before and still dominate is Iran. It's the only country where people say to me all the time, well, how do you know your polls in Iran are accurate? Because the top issue is political reform. The second issue is right up there is corruption. After that is women's rights, etc. People in Iran, both supporters of Rouhani and opponents of Rouhani, want the political system to change and change dramatically on many levels. That is not the case we find in other countries. They want a job. They want to get their kids educated. They want to know they've got a future, and they want to know if they get sick, they can be taken care of. Those are the issues that dominate and trump in life. And the government in Egypt didn't produce. The Brotherhood didn't produce. They didn't produce in Tunisia. And that's why the bill is absolutely right. That's why the turmoil exists, because governments haven't produced what people hoped for.
Which U.S. state is Iran? You can think
Alaska, because you can see Russia.
Radwan, do you want to comment on the international aspect of?
Yeah.
Wait a second, what does that make Sarah Palin? Right?
Yeah, well,
Sorry for that, Sarah.
I mean, I agree. The main challenges in Tunisia are the economic challenges. This is the main reason why people went out to the street and overthrew. It's corruption. What was unique, I think, in the revolution is that people understood the link between economic development and political reforms. Mm-hmm. You know, they understood the political system was the main reason why we don't have good economic development, because of corruption and because of injustices in the way that resources are distributed in the country and all that. So, but of course, the economic reasons were the main one. They continue to be the main one. In this area, I think we had needed and expected more help from the international community to stabilize the economy, we're not asking, and Tunisians are not expecting a huge improvements in 2 years, but at least stabilize the economy so that people don't say, oh my gosh, we were better off under Ben Ali than we are now. So that hasn't really materialized. We got some assistance, but really nothing close to what Tunisia really needed. We got some assistance from Turkey, some from the European Union and Germany and UK. But really small amounts, you know, so the international community really has not stepped up, at least on the economic front, to stabilize the economy. In my opinion, this is needed to buy time, because the political transition takes time, no matter who's in charge. You're not going to build democracy in 1 year or 2 years. You'll be lucky if you write a constitution in 1 year or 2 years, a good constitution. So to build democracy, you're going to need 5 to 10 years. But in the meantime, you have to stabilize the economy for people to be patient and wait that long to see the fruits of the revolution and to see the fruits of the democratic process. Okay. Otherwise, people will begin to question what's this democracy all about? We didn't really benefit. We didn't, nothing changed. Freedom is good, but we want bread. We want to be able to feed put food on the table.
Okay, thanks, Radwan. Bill,
Yes.
comment on the regional, international?
I will start with the cliche of the taxi driver. I was just in Tunisia 3 weeks ago, and the first taxi driver said, "Vive Ben Ali," and the second taxi driver said, "We need a," it sounded like I used to hear in Algeria in 89, 90, 91, "We need Franco, we need a strong man to come in and take things over and straighten things out." And the third guy was going on and on about the failures of the government. Now, he had plenty of good things to say about the previous regime. So on one level, at least at the level of taxi drivers, those were my first 3 taxi drivers, we're already there. We're already post Ennahda's failures. What are the alternatives in terms of that small portion sampling of polling data?
Of 3 people.
Yeah, 3 people. I'm well aware of the deficiencies there. But I do agree with what was said about Tunisia feeling different, feeling separatable. I think Tunisia is watching Egypt right now, as is shown in the polling data, Zogby's polling data. I think what wasn't mentioned in the report is they're seeing Egypt through the lens of Algeria. I was in Tunisia for a year and then several other shorter periods in the 90s, and it was amazing. They were watching Algeria without discussing it. Algeria was a big gaping sort of wound in the Tunisian psyche, almost undiscussable in the 90s. I like to say that no Algerian in Tunisia ever turned me down for an interview, and no Tunisian ever accepted. And that wasn't quite true, but it was a taboo subject in the 90s, and the great pain of Algeria was felt in Tunisia in a very fundamental way. And there were some million Algerians living in Tunisia recounting the horrors. So that weighs heavily in the Tunisian psyche. I also would point out, in terms of international dimensions, the fall in popularity of Erdogan, Erdogan's recent failures. Erdogan had that victory lap he took, was it last summer or the summer before? Yeah, when he went around North Africa, and the populations weren't come out because the guy with the stick was telling them to come out. These were genuine outpourings of sympathy for Erdogan in the region. I think if Erdogan took a tour right now, nobody would come out. The fall of Erdogan, in terms of the international perception of Erdogan, is having an impact on the Turkish model as a model. A third thing I would say is, when I was in Tunisia, I heard, well, I just went to all countries. I was, Libya to Morocco, and they're all sending fighters to Syria. But the most I heard was Tunisia. I think there are 450 Tunisian deaths in Syria, maybe 250 Tunisian deaths in Algeria, about 90 Moroccans dead in Syria, and numbers in Libya as well, which are harder for me to nail down. But that means we have a lot of foreign fighters going from this region to Syria. There's been a lot of talk about the sexual jihadists. A lot of that reporting was invented by the Syrian mukhabarat, but there has been some of that. It's unclear what there's been and all that, but Syria's playing in a big way in the psyche of most young Tunisians, for and against all the departures of Tunisians to Syria, and the degree to which some young Tunisians see that as a continuation of the Arab Spring. And not only the 20% in the poll that supported the Salafists, but even beyond that, there is sympathy for the plight of the Syrian people and the lack of international action on Syria. Just in terms of the West, I fully agree with what Radwan said, so I won't belabor that point about the lack of international support for Tunisia. But I was just noticing yesterday on cable news, Nicholas Burns, the former number 3 at State, or was it this morning? I think it was yesterday, was on cable news talking about how the reverberations of the U.S. shutdown across the world, and how there's a lot of questioning about America's leadership, which we get in these situations, that America really can't afford to be a part-time power. This is part of the problem, but we have a very similar problem of inattention, which has a much longer roots in Washington, which we call we used to call in the State Department and other places I worked in D.C. the shiny bauble effect. So Washington's always chasing the new crisis, and has a hard time sustaining programmatic and policy focus on countries of priority. There was some attempt in the later Bush administration to undo that by having a list of priority countries, which was never published, but we used to talk about it within the department. There's other ways in which the White House and the NSC will come up with their priority lists. But if you're not supporting Tunisia, of the 18 Arab countries that rose up and the 6 that had significant outcomes from the Arab Spring, who are you supporting? And on that point, I'd say if the number 1 or number 2 priority is economics, which I'm convinced it is, and countries do have to walk and chew gum at the same time, so you have to address security and economics simultaneously. You can't do one before the other. It didn't work in Iraq. It doesn't work anywhere else. But the degree to which it's economics, we still haven't understand Tunisia's economic problems. Do you mind if I just say a minute or two on that? Because
Quickly, because I do want to turn it to the floor.
Yeah, because this is critical for understanding. Tunisia was the most successful economy in the Arab world, not just with phony statistics. With the real statistics, it was the best economy in the Arab world before the Arab Spring. So what was it about the Tunisian economy that took things down? In a nutshell, rampant corruption, the inability to create jobs in rural areas, and the plight of the diplômés chômeurs, the university graduates, whose unemployment rate was much higher than less educated Tunisians. And if you're not addressing these fundamental issues of economics and what was actually wrong with the economy, the old macroeconomic solutions which are being discussed around Washington this week with the World Bank and IMF meetings won't work for Tunisia. And I would continue to point out, I hammer away at this constantly, most Tunisians work in the informal economic sector, and most of the economic policies continue to exclude most Tunisians from the formal and the informal economic sector. If people don't find a way towards a job and towards a livelihood, you can have all the macroeconomic support you want. You're not going to solve the underlying issues of Tunisian economic dysfunctionality.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Radwan. Thank you, Bill. Let's turn it to the floor. There are microphones, I believe, somewhere. So we'll start over here. Please introduce yourself. Maybe stand up as well. That might help some people in the back. Why not? Yes.
Okay. My name is Abdul Wahab Al-Kibsi. I'm with the Center for International Private Enterprise. I'm an optimist by nature, and you have to be an optimist when it comes to Tunisia, because if it doesn't work in Connecticut, Jim, it's not going to work anywhere else. And I wonder where you put Yemen in all of this. But I'm worried about a couple of things. I hope you can alleviate some of my worries. I'll go very quickly. The first one, I noticed that coalition building right now in Tunisia is built around what you're opposed, not what you want to work on, not what you want to fix. So the opposition right now has labor and business, has nationalists and leftists. So if Ennahda fails and they come, it'll be more fragmented than ever. So I don't think the coalition building is where you need it to be. But more, I'm worried about the economic situation. Everybody mentioned it, everybody alluded to it. But the anger after the revolution has been manifested in Tunisia and the rest of the Arab world into populist demands. They want more government jobs, they want more subsidies. You talk to Ennahda, you talk to the Muslim Brothers in Egypt before they were thrown out, they understand what the problems are. They understand that the private sector needs to generate these jobs. They need to cut subsidies, they need to cut state employment. But the discourse is very different, they're cowards. They go and say, we're going to hire more people. So we haven't even started to discuss what needs to be done. We're moving backwards. Please tell me I'm wrong.
Thank you. From the back, there was a hand in the back. Could you raise your hand and stand up, please, so we can... Stand up. There we go.
Thanks very much. Hello to all my colleagues and friends on the panel, and a special hello and welcome to Paul.
Hi, Dan.
Hi. Dan Brumberg, Georgetown University, and furlough land as well, as some of us refer to it these days. One of the themes that we're hearing in this panel, and I welcome anybody's comment on the following, I think obvious but important point, and that is the divide between popular opinion and political opinion within the political elite. I mean, I think if you took this same poll and ran it by the political elite, and particularly those who have been sitting in the Constituent Assembly, you'd find the degree of polarization even higher, and it would revolve around political issues. And I think that's a really interesting point to keep in mind, because there's a disjuncture between the popular opinion and the actions and motivations of the political elite. And I'd love to hear any comments on that. And the second follow-up question, this is particularly for Radwan. I mean, to the extent that the Constituent Assembly has been profoundly polarized, this is echoed in the debate on the Constitution. And Ennahda spent a lot of time making proposals on Sharia and so on that were simply unacceptable to the other side. So you spent a year creating a degree of polarization which was completely unnecessary. And if everybody had their heads screwed on correctly, they would recognize that the fundamental issues are economic, and that they should move ahead and not make proposals that are completely unacceptable to the secularists. So yes, there's an emerging consensus, but there's been a lot of time that seems to be wasted. You could have had a consensus on the Constitution much earlier had the proposals that were inevitably rejected by Ennahda itself not been made to begin with. So I'd like to hear your comment, Radwan, on that.
Thank you, Dan. In the front.
I'm Ahmaduddin Ahmed with the Minaret of Freedom Institute. Direct my question to Jim Zogby, but I'd be interested in anyone else's opinion on this. When you made the observation that democracy and the process, the transition to democracy is alive and well in Tunisia, my question is, to what degree would that have been different if the Ennahda party, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, had refused to step down?
Thank you. Last question in this round, the lady here in the second row here.
My name is welcome here. My name is Fatim Belghith. I'm an activist since 2007 against the Ben Ali regime. I'm from Tunisia. I came here for only 2 months. I'm explaining that because I'm going to speak about my point of view of an activist, independent, one in the opposition coming 2 months ago from Tunisia. Well, first, I don't totally agree with the fact that Tunisia is divided, because we have a strong bond in Tunisia, which is loving life and enjoying life. It's a mentality thing. So we can never be divided. But we are frightened. Why we are frightened? Because first, the regime, the Ennahda, is putting something, in the mentality of the society that we are not used of it, which is being considering the religion, I mean Islam, a point that can divide us. We're talking about you are practicing the religion, Islam or not. This is the point that's frightening Tunisian nowadays. We are not, we're supposed to be all Muslims. We have different practices, one more than others, but it has been never a point that divided us. Nowadays, it becomes something that we are frightened from it. Another thing that Tunisians are frightened from it is the behavior of the Ennahda, the Troika in general, those days. They are doing the same practices that Ben Ali used to do. I mean, putting their leaders in the administrative, police, military positions, which is really against the democracy, and which is one of the main causes that the revolution has started about it. I don't think that Tunisia is only dissatisfied, just one part. I think it's spending mode. Because it's a mentality thing also. You have mentioned it. The Tunisian society, they are waiting for a leader, kind of person who will save them. It's a historic thing. Bourguiba, then Ben Ali. I think it's time to work on the society, as the civil society especially, so they change this position and they start working together, all the political, or taking the youth as a solution instead of just waiting for someone to save them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bill and Radwan, Jim, you want to pick one or two of the questions?
Yes, on the first point about economics, I couldn't agree more. This isn't a panel on economics, so I'm not going to run through my 20-point plan. Just briefly, let me say that every time I see an announcement that a Tunisian ministry is creating another 25,000 jobs, these type of jobs like you see in Egypt, where there are 20 people that work in an office, but there's only 2 chairs because the other 18 people don't need to come. This sort of creation of government salaries and government jobs to mollify is in direct opposition to the whole dignity message of the Tunisian revolution. People don't just want jobs with salaries, they want jobs that are meaningful. And so I really believe that there needs to be a whole deep rethink on how to use Tunisia's youth that has to do with mobilizing groups of Tunisians around solving problems in every sector. And I'm happy to elaborate that in a future discussion or later on or afterwards. In terms of Daniel Brumberg comment about the disjuncture, I totally agree with what I said, and that it's more polarized at the top. The only thing I would add is that there are class dynamics, there are regional dynamics, And there are a lot of sort of localized problems out there in the Tunisian hinterland, which are not necessarily not articulated, but regional and need to be kind of separated out as well. I totally agree that if Ennahda had refused to step down, there would have been a different sort of outcome, but certainly not the same outcome as Egypt, because the role of the military is different. There's a different history there. Let me also say that there was a debate that our fieldwork dredged up before the elections of 2011 in Ennahda, and senior people in Ennahda were against running in and winning the elections, and there was more junior elements in Ennahda that wanted to win, and this was the problem of all the revolutionary countries in the Arab Spring, because us pundits on the outside were saying you don't want to be the first party to win an election in that country, and that was true for all of the countries. And so by winning the first election, all of these new layers of problems would be piled on whatever party won. So Ennahda is making a very strategically intelligent choice by pulling out now, which is going to bode well for them for the long term, because they're stepping out right at a point where everybody wants them to step out, but also in time to kind of save their reputation with their base and come in later to try again. So,
Thank you, Radwan.
On Bill's last point, I'm not a member of Ennahda, but I have very good contacts with many of their leaders. And what I keep hearing from them all the time is that our goal is for democracy to succeed in Tunisia. We don't really care. It's not important whether we win or we lose, whether we are in the ruling coalition or in opposition. That really doesn't matter. A goal is, how do we make democracy succeed? And this is why, you know, we've had all these opportunities for dialogue and for negotiations and for give and take. Now, on the economic front, I agree with you, Abdul, that we haven't really had any kind of discussion on the economic reforms that need to take place. But I think that's very understandable. The focus right now is on building democracy. The focus is on how do we reform the political system so that, A, we guarantee we don't have another dictatorship. That's the main goal. And B, that we open up space for civil society and for all the individuals and citizens to participate in the new Tunisia. If we don't do that, then economic reforms are meaningless, in my opinion. If dictatorship comes back, corruption will come back, and therefore the goal right now is build democracy, finish the constitution, and then establish a democratic framework. And then, of course, the economic discussion has to take place. The question from Dan about Sharia, I don't know, Dan, is he here?
He is here, yes. I see him.
He's there.
He's there, trust me.
Okay. Ennahda from March 2012, which was really the beginning of writing the first draft of the Constitution. The first draft came out in June of 2012. Announced that there will not be any mention of Sharia in the Constitution. So it's not true that Ennahda insisted on Sharia or that there was any really push for Sharia to be included in. From the beginning, that was taken off the table. No Sharia, no mention of Sharia in the Constitution, not because Ennahda is against Sharia, but because Sharia means different things to different people. We're not all clear on what Sharia means, and therefore let's not even include it in the Constitution. And believe me, Dan, we worked extremely hard, all Tunisians, especially civil society, and especially CSID, on building consensus on the Constitution. And I'm very confident when I tell you that we basically have consensus on the Constitution. Consensus does not mean 100%. I don't think that's ever going to be the case. To me, consensus means 70% or 80%, but not 100%. If they go back and start voting on the Constitution tomorrow, I think we can pass the Constitution very easily with 2/3 or more majority. The last point about Fatin's comments. We are all Muslims in Tunisia, I agree, but we have different interpretations of Islam, and we have different interpretations of Islam's role in politics or in public life in general. And this is very normal. This is a healthy debate. This happens even in the United States. It happens in Europe. It happens in every country. So when we are divided about this, there is nothing wrong with being divided. All democratic countries are divided. You have leftists, you have rightists, you have people in the middle. I mean, look at the United States right now. Is there a country that's more divided than the United States, the oldest democracy in the world? But as long as we put in place a peaceful way to solve these issues, to discuss them and resolve them peacefully. And this is why I'm very optimistic. My last comment, why I'm very optimistic about Tunisia, because the military in Tunisia is not thinking and has never thought and will never think about a coup d'etat. It is truly a Republican military that has historically always stayed out of politics, has never been involved in politics. My father was a military officer, so I know what I'm talking about. They simply are not interested in politics. They know their role is to defend the country, and that's it. This is the blessing. Therefore, we have differences. We will resolve them politically and peacefully, not with the military.
Thank you, Radwan. Jim, do you have any comments on these questions?
Just to look at the numbers on the issue of religion. I find it mixed. The biggest, I mean, why is the most popular leader the Secretary General of Ennahda? And popular both among, and actually he's the most popular among those who support Ennahda, the second most popular after Ghanouchi, but he's the second most popular after those who don't have confidence in Ennahda, after the general. And the interesting thing is that the general and Jabali both are popular because they took a courageous decision.
Yep.
One to resign and the other to not use violence. So it's not the same as the polarity of the debate in Egypt over the Brotherhood is truly a pox on their house. I mean, there could be no Muslim Brotherhood leader who'd get good ratings among those who are opposed to the Brotherhood. But it's a different situation here. I don't think people are as afraid of Ennahda in Tunisia as they are of the Brotherhood in Egypt. Maybe they're more confident of their own ability to resist an Islamicization of the society. And I found also interesting that among Ennahda supporters, the failure of the government to combat terrorism and extremism was greater than among those who opposed Ennahda. And the criticism of the government not ending corruption was also greater among Ennahda supporters than the other. And finally, on the issue of it was the failure of the government to deal with these issues. It was also the monopolization of power, not of their Islamicizing power, but of monopolizing power and dominating. One of the things we found when we did the crosstabs and looked at the individual groups, the two coalition partners, was that the overlap between Ennahda and them was so significant because they were being pushed up by the fact that Ennahda people had confidence in them. They didn't have confidence. Those who were, for example, from Etakatul were not supportive of Ennahda. Those who were supportive of Etakatul were not supportive of Ennahda, but Ennahda people were supportive of them. So it boosted their numbers up. It gave them an inflated number in terms of the confidence level. On the part of the opposition parties, they were very separate and distinct one from another. The coalition partners were sort of fused at the hip, and the fuse, the solder, all came from Ennahda, not the other way, not in reverse. So Ennahda exhausted itself not just with the general public, but even with their own coalition partners, who said, "We're kind of in a coalition.
Their own members.
We're in a coalition with you, but we don't have any power. We may have a minister, but we don't have any power. You are dominating the government." That's what the numbers were showing, was that Ennahda is dominating the government and not being effective as a result of it. Not because of religion so much. They would disagree with them on the religion issue, but I don't think they feared it as much as they were upset with their ineffectiveness and fearing the fact that they were controlling too much.
Thank you, Jim. A last round of questions. Yes, the lady in the second row.
Hi, my name is Lenore Bajar-Dukes. I was formerly with Search for Common Ground in Tunisia, and now I'm with Leilina Productions. I am wondering about the role of youth in this discussion about dissatisfaction with the government and the democratic transition. I think, as almost 50% of the population, it's a demographic that needs to be talked about. I'm wondering to what extent their dissatisfaction or their exclusion might be different from that of the rest of the population or not.
No, actually, the numbers were flat.
Wow.
On most issues, even their gender, obviously on women's rights there was a difference, but not that great. But on education and on rural city and age, flat line. The opposition was the same. The only relevant crosstab that I could find that actually established a distinction was, ideological or, identify. Those who supported Ennahda were one way and those who didn't were another way. But on all the other demographics, the sort of the hard demographics, not a difference in the world.
Which way did that go? Were the younger for or against Ennahda?
No, not at all.
breakdown.
No difference
Okay.
at all. Even in terms of those who supported Ennahda, equal numbers of old and young. Those who opposed, equal numbers of old and young. No difference in attitudes that I saw.
That's fascinating because I think we've been hearing a lot about youth exclusion from political institutions and structures of power. And I'd like to hear also about if you think that hype about youth being a destructive force in some of the polarization, some of the protests has been exaggerated, or if they are contributing to that.
Thank you. Sir, here in the front row. Yes, sir.
I'm Steve Buck. I used to be Office Director for North Africa at the State Department. I'd just be interested, I know Mr. Masmoudi, I think, has mentioned this, but the significance of the difference between Tunisia and Egypt in that Tunisia, the military has always had a secondary role from Bourguiba, and to the degree to which that really makes a profound difference, and are U.S. policymakers focusing on that?
Thank you. A last question in the back there. Keep your hand up so the microphone can reach you. There you go.
Hello, my name is Alexandre Bilodeau. I'm a Canadian diplomat. I've just returned from a 2-year assignment in Tunis where I was working at the Canadian Embassy, and I'm currently at the State Department Ambassador. My question is about
What's your name again?
Alexandre Bilodeau. My question is about the current talks or the prospects of the talks, and I'd be interested in hearing the panel's views on whether these talks, given the high degree of suspicion among the parties, and in fact the rejection of one of the Troika members, the CPR, to even partake in the talks, what are the prospects of these being successful, at least in the short to medium term, in actually bridging or transitioning towards election, and what does it mean in terms of the legitimacy of whatever institution will emanate from these talks? The UGTT, as I think Mr. Lawrence mentioned, is playing a very important role in providing the architecture for these talks. But there are a lot of concerns among Tunisians about the legitimacy of the UGTT. Files of corruptions have not been brought to the fore, have not been investigated, and the UGTT, notwithstanding its key role, at least at the base, in the revolution, a lot of questions still remain about the leadership and Salem and others. So I'd like to get your views on that, please.
Thank you. Let's turn to our panel. Quick remarks. Bill, you want to start?
Sure. On the role of youth, I'm right there with you on the premises of your question about how youth are often misportrayed. And I think James Zogby's response to you bears out the premise of your question, that actually youth are often misportrayed. I would point out, in addition to that Tunisia has the oldest population that I'm aware of in the Arab world. The median age is 30. In most other countries, it's 27 or 24, 19. But so they've already made the demographic transition, and that's why I always focus so much on the unemployed university graduates, because the unemployment rates, because of the informal sector for non or less educated Tunisians, are quite low in comparison to the university graduates, which remains very, very high. And that has to do with all kinds of structural issues I won't get into. But for me, that's been that and rural unemployment, those are the two prongs for me. In terms of the comments on the military, that's extremely important. And it was a great frustration for me personally when I was at the State Department, how little we cared about the long-standing relationship between the U.S. and the Tunisian militaries. Tunisia, because of its bad human rights record, would get swept up in Washington's desire to punish Tunisia for its human rights record during the 2000s, when in fact the Tunisian military was civilian-led and had nothing to do with the human rights problems, which were all coming from the police and the security services, and they were, and the Tunisian government actually had to end-run the State Department and go to Congress to just get its military, which had been zeroed out by the executive branch, had to go to Congress to lobby for its military aid to be plussed up. And during the Tunisian revolution, although Morjan denied it to my face more than once, I am sure phone calls were made during the Tunisian revolution between Tunisian military officials and American military officials, because they all knew each other, about moves which helped the Tunisian revolution at the critical moments move in the direction that Rashid Ammar wanted to take it. The prospects of the talks, I mean, the problem is, as you defined it and everyone else in the panel defined it, is this level of suspicion. And it's clear in the polling data as well that we have this high level of suspicion, but you can't do anything but try to negotiate past the suspicion. And it's been said before today, but I have to underscore the fact that coming from Washington this week, I can't say anything about dysfunctionality and suspicion, to any government anywhere. In fact, when I was a diplomat, I was keenly, every time I had to go demarche somebody on anything, I would start with everything I could think of that the U.S. government was wrong on that score, whether it was human rights or trafficking. We're awful at trafficking in this country. Wouldn't even pass their own tests. So as a diplomat, you have to kind of start with, okay, how am I going to establish credibility here by admitting the problems my own country has, and let's have a dialogue about the problems in your country. And this confidence building has a long way to go in Tunisia, and I would underscore again the primary reason on that score being the series of political assassinations. It wasn't just Brahimi which caused this political crisis. It's not just Shukri Belaid, which almost caused the previous one. It goes all the way back to the Nida Tunis assassination of, what's the guy's name? I'm forgetting, who was beat up by the Leagues of the Revolution. And right up until this winter, Ennahda was defending the League of the Revolution guys who had pummeled this guy, lynched him is the word they used in the Tunisian press, to death. Because they saw him as a counter-revolutionary, and Nida Tunis is counter-revolutionary. So you've had a series of political assassinations that Ennahda has not done enough to. Now, I totally agree with what Radwan said about the shift since the embassy, attack, and the fact that. The break with Ansar Sharia and the Salafists is really important in terms of Ennahda's success and political survival. But the trust has already been broken. And so we need to get past these. Did you see the numbers in the Zogby poll? 3. And if you look at some of those late numbers when it comes to credibility, 3% of this group or that group have any credibility, any trust in the other side. So we've got to get past that. Thank you.
Radwan, any last comments?
On the role of the youth, I fully agree with you. It's a big problem. Only about 15% of the youth voted in the last election. So this is even before the new government or Ennahda or anything else. Young people obviously played a big role in the revolution, but then decided to abstain from voting. And that's a big problem because they're not engaged in the political process. They need to be more engaged. But this is going to be a challenge long term because they don't know how to get involved and how to participate in the political process. In terms of the role of the military, Steve's question, I think they're doing a tremendous job in fighting terrorism and in protection of the borders. We have a huge border with Algeria and Libya, and both are problematic in terms of terrorism and arms smuggling. So I think the military is really stepping up and doing a fantastic job. But they have no role whatsoever in politics, and I think all Tunisians agree on this point. The prospects of the talks, the national dialogue talks, I think that it's very important that they are taking place, but I'm not sure that they're going to succeed. in this round or in the next round. It's a very, very difficult and complicated process. From day one, even before they started, the UGTT gave everybody a list of conditions, many of which have not even been seen or discussed before. And this is why 3 or 4 of the main parties, not Ennahda, but other parties, refused to sign this document because they've never seen it before. And you can't impose conditions before the dialogue even begins. And I think we have a serious problem with the UGTT being used as a political tool. Historically, UGTT was very powerful, very strong, because it was open to all Tunisians, no matter what their political persuasion is. But I think in the last year, it's becoming more and more politicized. And this is very dangerous for UGTT itself and for the political process in general, because it is a formidable organization, but if it tries to become play as if it is a political party or as if it is it starts to take sides between the political players, then not only it will self-destruct, but it will not be helpful to the process of national dialogue.
Thank you, Radwan. Jim, any last comments? Well, on behalf of everybody, first I'd like to thank Jim for the excellent work that his group is doing and for this data about opinion in Tunisia, which obviously is food for a lot of thought. I'd like to thank Radwan and Bill for their very insightful comments. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you at a future MEI event.